there is a triangle of questions that most human beings carry for their entire lives. Not always consciously, not always with the vocabulary of philosophy or theology, but present, nevertheless, in the back of the mind during difficult seasons, in the chest during grief, in the throat when someone you love is suffering and nothing you can do is enough to stop it. The first question is about God, whether there is one, what kind, whether it cares. The second question is about karma, why things happen the way they do, whether there is any coherence to the distribution of circumstance and consequence, whether the universe is, at its core, fair. And the third question is about suffering, why it exists, why it falls where it does, why the innocent suffer and the guilty sometimes do not, why the person who prayed the hardest, loved the most, tried the most sincerely, sometimes loses the most. These three questions orbit each other constantly because they are not really separate questions. They are three angles of approach to a single enormous ancient problem, the problem of making sense of a human life. And what is extraordinary about the Bhagavad Gita, what makes it unlike almost any other spiritual text produced in the history of the world, is that it does not treat these questions separately. It does not offer a theology here and a philosophy of karma there and a consolation about suffering somewhere else. It connects them at the root through a single, unified vision of reality that, when you genuinely receive it, changes the way all three questions feel. That is what I want to explore with you today. How Krishna connects God, karma, and suffering, and what that connection reveals about the nature of the life you are living right now. Stay with me. Let us begin with the connection that most people miss entirely. The one that, when seen, reorganizes everything else. Most people think about God, karma, and suffering as three separate realities that happen to interact. God is over here, divine, powerful, perhaps good. Karma is over there, a cosmic mechanism of cause and effect, operating according to its own logic. And suffering is somewhere in between, the experience of consequences that the mechanism produces in the lives of beings who are subject to it. In this framework, God and karma are essentially separate systems, and the question of suffering becomes the problem of reconciling them, of explaining why a God who is good presides over a karma system that produces so much pain. This is the framework within which most theodicy, in the philosophical attempt to justify divine goodness in the presence of suffering, operates, and it almost never fully satisfies, because the gap between a good God and a suffering world, when approached as a gap between two separate things, cannot be cleanly bridged. Krishna does not work within this framework. He does not try to bridge the gap between God and karma because, in his teaching, there is no gap to bridge. God is not separate from karma. God is not the administrator of karma, looking in from outside. God is the ground in which karma moves, the awareness in which all action and all consequence occurs, the intelligence that is woven through the entire structure of cause and effect, not as an external presence that occasionally intervenes, but as the very substance of what makes the system coherent at all. And suffering is not separate from either of them. It is the experience of a particular kind of contact between consciousness and the movement of karma, shaped by the degree to which that consciousness is identified with the surface of experience rather than the depth. When you see this connection, when God, karma, and suffering are understood not as three separate things but as three aspects of a single reality, the questions do not disappear, but they transform. They stop being three separate puzzles requiring three separate solutions. They become one question, moving in three directions, pointing always toward the same center. And that center is what Krishna spends the entire Gita helping Arjuna find. Let us go deeper into what Krishna actually says about karma, because his teaching here is both more precise and more surprising than most people expect. In the 4th chapter, he says something that stops the ordinary mind cold. He says, I have created the fourfold order of society according to the divisions of qualities and duties. Though I am the creator of this, know me to be the non-doer, the one who does not change. And then, a few verses later, actions do not taint me. I have no desire for the fruits of action. One who understands me thus is not bound by actions. This is an astonishing statement. The divine creates the entire structure within which karma operates, within which action and consequence are possible, and yet is not bound by what it creates. Participates in the creation of the world, and yet is not entangled in the consequences of that participation. How is this possible? Because the divine acts without attachment, creates without clinging to what the creation produces, moves the world forward without making the world's response the condition of its inner peace. And this is not only a description of the divine, it is a teaching, a demonstration. Krishna is showing Arjuna, and through Arjuna, every person who reads the Gita, what it looks like to be in the world, to act in the world, to participate fully in the movement of cause and effect without being caught in the cycle that most human beings cannot escape. The divine is not exempt from karma. It is free within karma. And that freedom is not a divine prerogative that human beings cannot access. It is the very freedom that the entire Gita is trying to point human beings toward. This is the first deep connection between God and karma. God is not the administrator of karma from outside. God is the demonstration of how to move through karma from within without being bound. Now let us bring suffering into the picture, because here is where the teaching gets genuinely difficult and where it demands something of us that is harder than intellectual assent. Krishna says in the 2nd chapter, the teaching that is perhaps the most startling in the entire text, the soul is never born, the soul never dies. It is not slain when the body is slain. For the soul there is never birth nor death. It is not born, and it does not die. It has not come into being, does not come into being, and will not come into being. It is unborn, eternal, ever-existing, and primeval. It is not slain when the body is slain. What is this saying about suffering? It is not saying that suffering is not real. It is not a denial of the pain that embodied consciousness experiences as it moves through the world. The body suffers, the mind suffers, the personality suffers. Grief is real. Loss is real. The agony of watching someone you love in pain is real. But Krishna is pointing to a dimension of what you are. That is not the body, not the mind, not the personality. A depth in the structure of consciousness, the Atman that is not reached by what reaches the surface, that remains through everything the surface experiences unchanged. And when you understand what this means for suffering, really understand it, not as an idea, but as a felt recognition, the relationship to suffering transforms, not because the suffering disappears, but because the one suffering is no longer identical with the suffering, because the awareness in which the pain is arising is larger than the pain, because there is something present in the middle of the most devastating experience that has not been destroyed by the devastation. This is what Krishna means when he says, weapons cannot cut the soul, fire cannot burn it, water cannot wet it, wind cannot dry it. He is not denying the wounds of the surface. He is pointing to the depth that the wounds cannot reach. But this still leaves an enormous question unanswered, and I want to face it directly. If the soul is indestructible, if the Atman is beyond suffering, then why does suffering exist at all? If God is good, and God is the ground of all reality, why does the surface of that reality contain so much pain? Krishna's answer to this is not a justification. It is not an explanation designed to make suffering seem acceptable. It is something harder and ultimately more honest. He says the field of karma, the world in which action and consequence operate, is characterized by what the Vedic tradition calls the threefold suffering. The suffering that comes from one's own body and mind, the suffering that comes from other beings, and the suffering that comes from nature and circumstance beyond anyone's control. He does not say this suffering is good. He does not say it was designed by a benevolent creator for the purpose of making people stronger or wiser or more spiritually mature. He says it is the nature of the field, the characteristic of existence in the material dimension of reality, the texture of what it is like to be an embodied consciousness moving through a world governed by consistent principles of cause and effect. And then he says something more important than any explanation. I am the Atman seated in the hearts of all beings. Not, I am the one who designed the suffering for a purpose. Not, I am the one who will eventually remove it if you earn that removal. I am here, inside the experience, in the awareness that is receiving the suffering, as close to the center of what you are as anything can possibly be. The connection between God and suffering in Krishna's teaching is not the connection between a designer and a design. It is the connection between a presence and what it is present within. God does not justify suffering. God accompanies it from the inside. There is a moment in the Gita that I find more moving than almost any other. It comes in the 11th chapter. In the vision of the cosmic form, the Vishvarupa that Arjuna receives when he asks to see Krishna as he truly is. What Arjuna sees in that moment dissolves the framework within which he has been asking his questions. Because what he sees is not a God who is separate from the world, managing it from outside. What he sees is a reality so vast that it contains everything, every being, every moment, every birth, and death, and joy, and devastation simultaneously within a single awareness. He sees time, not as a sequence of events, but as a presence. He sees the entire arc of existence, past and future and present, held within a consciousness that is not moved by any of it the way individual beings are moved. That witnesses all of it with a quality of stillness that is not indifference, but something beyond either involvement or detachment. And he sees this is the part that is most relevant for understanding suffering, that nothing is outside of it. No grief, no war, no destruction, no pain. Nothing that exists in the field of karma is outside the awareness of the divine. Nothing is happening somewhere that God is not. The suffering of the world is not occurring in a corner of reality where the divine has not looked. It is occurring within the divine awareness. And that awareness, however incomprehensible its scale, however far beyond the human categories of good and bad, is not absent from any of it. This does not explain suffering. I want to be clear about that. It does not tell us why this particular pain fell on this particular person at this particular time. It does not provide the rational justification that the philosophical mind demands. What it does is something different, something I would argue more important. It tells us that the suffering is witnessed, known, not from a distance, from within, and that witnessing that accompaniment is itself a form of presence that, once genuinely received, changes the quality of the experience of suffering in a way that explanation never can. But this still leaves an enormous question unanswered, and I want to face it directly. If the soul is indestructible, if the Atman is beyond suffering, then why does suffering exist at all? If God is good, and God is the ground of all reality, why does the surface of that reality contain so much pain? Krishna's answer to this is not a justification. It is not an explanation designed to make suffering seem acceptable. It is something harder and, ultimately, more honest. He says the field of karma, the world in which action and consequence operate, is characterized by what the Vedic tradition calls the threefold suffering. The suffering that comes from one's own body and mind, the suffering that comes from other beings, and the suffering that comes from nature and circumstance beyond anyone's control. He does not say this suffering is good. He does not say it was designed by a benevolent creator for the purpose of making people stronger or wiser or more spiritually mature. He says, it is the nature of the field, the characteristic of existence in the material dimension of reality, the texture of what it is like to be an embodied consciousness, moving through a world governed by consistent principles of cause and effect. And then he says something more important than any explanation. I am the Atman seated in the hearts of all beings. Not, I am the one who designed the suffering for a purpose. Not, I am the one who will eventually remove it if you earn that removal. I am here, inside the experience, in the awareness that is receiving the suffering, as close to the center of what you are as anything can possibly be. The connection between God and suffering in Krishna's teaching is not the connection between a designer and a design. It is the connection between a presence and what it is present within. God does not justify suffering. God accompanies it from the inside. There is a moment in the Gita that I find more moving than almost any other. It comes in the 11th chapter, in the vision of the cosmic form, the Vishvarupa that Arjuna receives when he asks to see Krishna as he truly is. What Arjuna sees in that moment dissolves the framework within which he has been asking his questions, because what he sees is not a God who is separate from the world, managing it from outside. What he sees is a reality so vast that it contains everything, every being, every moment, every birth and death and joy and devastation simultaneously within a single awareness. He sees time, not as a sequence of events, but as a presence. He sees the entire arc of existence, past and future and present, held within a consciousness that is not moved by any of it the way individual beings are moved. That witnesses all of it with a quality of stillness that is not indifference, but something beyond either involvement or detachment. And he sees this is the part that is most relevant for understanding suffering, that nothing is outside of it. No grief, no war, no destruction, no pain. Nothing that exists in the field of karma is outside the awareness of the divine. Nothing is happening somewhere that God is not. The suffering of the world is not occurring in a corner of reality where the divine has not looked. It is occurring within the divine awareness. And that awareness, however incomprehensible its scale, however far beyond the human categories of good and bad, is not absent from any of it. This does not explain suffering. I want to be clear about that. It does not tell us why this particular pain fell on this particular person at this particular time. It does not provide the rational justification that the philosophical mind demands. What it does is something different, something I would argue more important. It tells us that the suffering is witnessed, known, not from a distance, from within, and that witnessing that accompaniment is itself a form of presence that, once genuinely received, changes the quality of the experience of suffering in a way that explanation never can. Let us talk now about what connects karma and suffering most directly, because this is where the teaching becomes most practically useful for understanding why things happen the way they do. Krishna describes karma not as a system of reward and punishment, but as a system of consequence and learning. Every action creates ripples in the medium of reality, in the web of relationships, circumstances, inner states, and outer conditions that constitute a human life. Those ripples return, not as divine judgment, as natural consequence. And the suffering that arises from karma, the pain that comes from having acted in ways that were harmful, or from living in the accumulated consequences of past actions whose roots you may not even remember this. Suffering is not punishment, it is information. It is the universe's way of maintaining its own integrity, the way reality communicates. This is not the direction of freedom. This is not the direction of alignment. This is not the path toward the peace that is your nature. Turn, adjust, come back. This reframing of suffering as information rather than punishment is not comfortable, because information implies responsibility, implies that the pain has something to teach, that the situation is asking for a response, that the discomfort is in some sense purposeful even if it is not designed. But it is profoundly more useful than the alternative, because information can be received, understood, and responded to. Punishment simply has to be endured. And when suffering is received as information, when the question asked of it shifts from why is this happening to me to what is this asking of me, something in the interior life of the person experiencing it begins to change. Not the suffering itself, necessarily, but the relationship to it, the quality of the consciousness that is meeting it. There is a teaching in the Gita on what Krishna calls the threefold division of action and its relationship to suffering, that I believe is one of the most practically illuminating things ever said about the human condition. He speaks of the three gunas, tamas, rajas, and sattva, as the fundamental qualities that characterize all action. And he says that the suffering of human beings is, in very large part, the suffering produced by action that is not in alignment with sattva. Action that comes from tamas, from dullness, from avoidance, from the fog of disconnection, produces a particular kind of suffering, chronic, low level, without direction. The suffering of a life that is going through the motions. Action that comes from rajas, from ego-driven ambition, from the desperate need for recognition and reward, from the anxiety of attachment to outcomes, produces a different kind of suffering. The suffering of someone who achieves and never finds what the achieving was supposed to deliver. The suffering of the relentless pursuit that never arrives. An action that comes from sattva, clear, aligned, offered without grasping, produces its own kind of friction, because the sattvic path is not without difficulty. It often requires moving against the current, making choices that are true rather than comfortable, giving what costs something to give. But the suffering that sattvic action produces has a different quality. It does not accumulate in the same way. It does not create the same density of karmic consequence. Because when action is offered freely, without the grip of ego investment in the result, the ripples it creates move differently through the medium of reality. This is the connection between karma and suffering that matters most for how you live. Not the retrospective question of why past suffering arose, that is largely invisible to us, extending back through more history than any single life can hold. But the perspective question, how do I act now in a way that does not generate the kind of karmic consequence that deepens suffering? And the answer, as Krishna gives it, is not to stop acting. It is to act better, more freely, more truly, more aligned with what is genuinely yours to do, offered as fully as you can offer it, released with as little grasping as you can manage in this moment. Not perfect, but more free than before. I want to speak now to the person who has been suffering for a long time, not the acute suffering of a recent loss, though that matters too, but the long suffering, the kind that has become so familiar it has almost ceased to feel like suffering and has started to feel like simply the texture of existence, the suffering of a life that has not gone the way you hoped. That has carried weight you did not ask for. That has produced grief that never fully resolved. That sometimes makes the question of why God and karma together conspire to produce this particular life with this particular pain feel not like a philosophical inquiry, but like a cry. I want to bring Krishna's teaching directly into that. He says, in one of the most compassionate passages of the Gita, I am quickly attained by the person who is always absorbed in thinking of me, for whom I am the supreme goal. After attaining me, the great souls never again return to this world of pain and temporariness. And then, even more directly, for those whose minds are fixed on me, I am the swift deliverer from the ocean of death-bound existence. swift deliverer. This is not the language of a distant God who observes suffering with benevolent neutrality. This is the language of a presence that moves toward the one who is suffering. That does not wait for the suffering to be resolved before offering accompaniment. That says, in the middle of it, I am here. Turn toward me, and I will meet you in the turning. This does not promise that the suffering will immediately lift. Krishna is too honest a teacher for false promises. The karma that has been set in motion will continue its movement. The consequences of past actions will arise in their own time, but the quality of what is carried through that movement changes when it is not carried alone. When the orientation of the heart, however imperfect, however interrupted by doubt and grief, and the sheer exhaustion of long-standing pain, is toward the divine presence that is already within the experience. The long suffering changes not when it ends, but when it is finally accompanied. I want to make something explicit that has been implicit throughout this entire teaching, because I think it is the most important connection Krishna draws between God, karma, and suffering, and it is the one that most directly answers the question of why any of this matters for the life you are actually living. The connection is this: the soul that understands what God is, and what karma is, and what suffering is, and understands how they are connected, is a soul that has found the ground from which it can stop being destroyed by the surface. Not stop feeling, not stop caring, not stop being moved by what is genuinely moving, but stop being destroyed by it. Stop being swept entirely off center by the waves of circumstance. Stop experiencing every difficult consequence as evidence that the universe has turned against it, that God is absent, that the suffering is the final word on the value and meaning of its existence. When you understand that God is not the administrator of consequences, but the awareness within which all consequences occur, that karma is not a punishment system, but the natural movement of cause and effect in a universe that maintains its integrity, that suffering is not evidence of divine abandonment, but the experience of a consciousness that has not yet found the ground that is deeper than the surface, then everything changes. Not the circumstances, not the pain, not the genuine difficulty of a life that has its share of loss and grief and unanswered questions, but the relationship of the self to all of it, the capacity to stand in the middle of it without being definitively undone. This is what Krishna is building in Arjuna across the entire Gita. Not a philosophy, not a theology, but a capacity. The capacity to be in the world fully in it, with all the risk and love and vulnerability that being fully in it requires from a place that the world cannot collapse. That place is the Atman, the eternal self, the awareness in which God, karma, and suffering all arise and are held, and ultimately, at the depth of things, are seen to be aspects of a single reality that is not broken. There is one final teaching I want to offer before we close, because it brings together everything we have explored and grounds it in something practical that you can actually carry with you. Krishna says in the 18th chapter, at the culmination of everything, he who by the practice of the yoga of meditation meditates on the imperishable ancient being, who is the ruler of all, subtler than the subtle, the maintainer of all, inconceivable in form, and as bright as the sun, and beyond this darkness he meditates on God. And then, with love, I will declare to you which is more easily attained. Fix your mind on me, be devoted to me, worship me, bow down to me, so shall you come to me. Fix your mind on me. In the context of everything we have been exploring, God, karma, suffering, the entire architecture of how reality is actually structured, this instruction is not devotional piety. It is a precise, practical directive for how to live in a way that is not ground down by the weight of consequence and pain and the unanswerable questions. Fix the mind, the attention, the orientation, the underlying direction of consciousness on the presence that is already within experience, the awareness that is the Atman, the ground that is not moved by what moves on the surface, not by ignoring the surface, not by pretending the consequences of karma are not real, or that suffering does not hurt, or that the hard questions have easy answers, but by developing, gradually and imperfectly, the habit of returning to the center, of recognizing, in the middle of what is hard, the presence that is not destroyed by what is hard, of trusting, even when trust is the most difficult thing available, that the awareness in which the suffering is occurring is not itself the suffering. God, karma, and suffering are connected not as three elements of a problem to be solved. They are connected as three dimensions of the single reality in which consciousness is learning to know its own depth, in which the embodied self is, through the full weight of its experience, being slowly, imperfectly, persistently moved toward the recognition of what it has always actually been. The journey is long. It is often painful. The karma is sometimes very heavy, but the ground is always there, beneath everything, as close as the awareness in which these words are arriving. It has not moved. It has never moved. And every time you find your way back to it, however briefly, however imperfectly, after however long you are doing the work, that the entire system of God and karma and suffering is, at its deepest level, designed to make possible coming home to what you are. If this teaching gave you something real, a thread of understanding, a moment of recognition, a small loosening of the grip that the questions sometimes have, carry it forward. Subscribe to this channel. Leave a like on this video, not as an exchange, but as a way of ensuring that this kind of depth and honesty finds its way to the next person who is sitting with the same ancient question, not yet knowing that someone has already answered it with more precision and more love than they imagined possible. We are building something here, a space where the hardest questions are not avoided, where God and karma and suffering are not separated into comfortable compartments, but brought together into the single vision that actually has the power to change things. You belong in that space, and you always have. Until next time, return to the ground, trust the awareness, and know that the presence you are looking for has been looking for you from the very beginning.